I'm wondering also, how do you see the future of the Quad? I think it's a very, I mean, it's a certain statement, a certain vision of Indo-Pacific region now, a rules-based international order. And I'm wondering if in the next decade or so, you see this informal arrangement becoming more formal arrangement and alliance. As you said, this importance of shared values, of norms and rules increases. We see all these diplomatic offensive to some extent now with Australia, with Japan, even with the United States. So India is at the core of all these diplomatic efforts. So what is the next stage of the Quad?
No, I think the Quad is going to acquire greater importance in the coming days. It is going to increasingly expand beyond its original 4 members. You've already seen South Korea, Vietnam, and other countries join these discussions in the last few weeks. It has already, in some sense, started meeting at the level of the foreign ministers. It has just happened again in the last couple of months. And you're going to see a growing emphasis by all of its members on doing a number of maneuvers and a number of projects, a number of initiatives together. You're going to see, in my view, in the next 5 years, the coming of age of Quad. And I think that process began with the pandemic. I see 3 areas where Quad can be absolutely essential. One, of course, is in delivering global public goods, keeping the sea lanes safe, open, and non-contested, so that trade and energy and people can move with a degree of stability and safety. So I think that's going to be one part of Quad. As other countries begin to underwrite the costs, the Americans are going to increasingly engage with partners in that particular activity, something that they used to do alone. So you're going to see Quad become part of, or rather replace, the Pax Americana that was underwriting stability in certain parts of the world. The second area is going to be, like I mentioned, around infrastructure and investments in certain parts of the world. I see the Quad grouping seed many initiatives. Their partner countries, sometimes bilaterally, sometimes with other countries, sometimes as Quad. Initiatives that will allow for big investments in countries which currently have only one option, and that option is called China. So will Quad be able to spawn a whole new array of instruments, financial instruments, infrastructure instruments, technology instruments that will cater to the needs and aspirations of South Asia, Africa, East Africa, especially, of course, West Asia and including eventually the Pacific Islands, etc. Mm-hmm. So you will see Quad again become a basis of that kind of a relationship in the coming days. And the third and most importantly, I think the role of the Quad will be to ensure that we don't reach a stage where we have to reject the Chinese. I think none of us wants a no China world because all of us benefit from China's growth, from China's trade and economic activities. We all want a responsible China world. And I think many of us have come to the conclusion the only way you can keep the Chinese honest in their engagements, be it economic or political, is to be able to put together a collective front in front of them and not negotiate individually, but negotiate as a group. The EU, of course, has done that for longer than anyone else. And that's why the Chinese don't like the EU. That's why they are slicing you down into your constituents so that they can get more favorable deals from you. But I guess the Quad in many ways is an expression of that reality as well. That the middle powers in the Asia Pacific, Indonesia, India, Australia, Japan, and others will have to work together, sometimes even without the Americans, to negotiate new terms of trade, the regional trading arrangements, the regional energy arrangements, the regional technology arrangements, the regional data flows and other arrangements. So the Quad in many ways is also the make China responsible arrangement. If the Quad was not available, the Chinese would not be held to account. So it is also an accountability framework which will keep the Chinese hopefully honest and responsible actors in the global system.
Mm-hmm. Do you also see this extending into the political sphere in a kind of a collective endeavor, both in Asia through the Quad and others, and in the West, starting with Europe perhaps, to build a new kind of world order? Because that's something that we've been discussing a lot in the transatlantic space as we have been faced with the narrative of the Western decline. One of the main questions was, fine, but if the US is withdrawing from some of its global responsibilities, and China is clearly not willing to step in as a responsible actor that's willing to craft an agenda that comes with a lot of global responsibility, then who's going to step in? Because everybody has been a challenger of the current global order, but very few were actually willing to take responsibility for crafting a new one. So do you feel that this kind of middle powers concert is one possible way to go? And if so, are we not likely to be disappointed, as we may have been to some extent, by the BRICS idea or ideal that was kind of put out there many years ago already, and then some of the BRICS sort of drowned in their own domestic problems? So, to sum up my very long question, do we see a global order emerging for which middle powers take responsibility? And are we, all of the middle powers involved, actually capable of doing that?
I think individually we are not capable of doing it. That's why we are called middle powers. We are not called big powers. If we were able to do it by ourselves, we would be big powers. We would be superpowers. And to be honest, we are a world which doesn't have any superpower anymore. I think the last superpower was America, and I think that ended with the financial crisis 10 years ago. And since then, we have literally been in a world which had quasi-superpowers, like the US, to some extent the Russians, to some extent the Chinese, but there was no real hegemon that could punish people for bad behavior and reward people for good behavior. I think that ended with Pax Americana in the early 2000s. Possibly the financial crisis was the manifestation of the end of that era. Coming back to the role of the middle powers, the Quad, and the future of, or the successor to the transatlantic or the Atlantic Partnership. Let me tell you that in the last few years, 2 to 3 years, some of the most excited actors in the Indian Ocean and the Indo-Pacific more broadly happen to be the UK and France. I think the French and UK have sensed a few years ago that if they need to be relevant in the future world order as it is shaped and as it is built and as it emerges, they need to be present in the debates that are unfolding in this part of the world. And they are no strangers to this part of the world. They have an old history, sometimes not too pleasant, but they have been actors in this region. And both of them have been partnering with India, have expressed their determination to be with India in the Indo-Pacific, to do military maneuvers, to create maritime domain awareness stations, to invest in infrastructure, and to create clearly the beginnings of a new order that might emerge from here. So be it Australia, which is a middle power, be it the French and the UK, which are old powers but middle powers, be it India, which is currently a middle power itself, we will have to create these coalitions to be able to get things done. The pandemic tells us something which is also quite tragic. I think since I was born, and that was quite a while ago, I have never been witness to a global crisis that did not have America lead the response. This pandemic is the first global crisis where Captain America is missing. And what makes it even more complicated is that the successor to Captain America has caused the crisis. So you have the old power which is absent and engrossed in its own domestic realities, and you have the new power that has been irresponsible and has put us in this position. So both the previous incumbent and the new pretender don't have the capacity to do too much in this world by themselves. And this tells us that building a coalition of middle powers is absolutely essential. It is not a luxury, it is not a choice. I think this is something for our own existential reasons that we must invest in.
Do you see this coalition of middle powers as something like again, I raise a previous concept, that of creating a league of democracy. It was raised at some point by John
UK.
McCain, now by Joe Biden. Stoltenberg is speaking about something similar. So do you see the potential of creating this league of democracy and being some sort of a manager and a supporter of the liberal international order to some?
I think it's inevitable. I think, like I mentioned to Oana in a couple of responses before this one, I think technology is so intimate that we are not going to trust our data with folks we don't.
So by default, will be democracy.
We have a suspicion of, right? So it makes a coalition of democracies, of like-minded countries, inevitable. And even if we may never call it that, it is going to become that. We are going to increasingly see countries engage with these intimate industries with others who are similar, who are like-minded, who have similar worldviews. And that is going to happen through a process which might take longer than we have. Now, my, therefore, recommendation to most governments is that while we may end up with that situation in a decade or more, we don't have the luxury of that time, because we will be destroyed and we will be divided and we will be decimated and we will be sliced much before that. So I think a few countries will have to take leadership, be it the French or the UK or the EU itself or India or all of them. We will have to put together a concert of democracies that till such time that we can all agree on a big vision for the new world order, we make sure that our interests, our values, our societies are protected. We will have to agree to a interim arrangement. We will have to create a bridge mechanism that takes us from the turmoil of the first 2 decades of this century to the stability of the second half of the century. Now, we don't want to go through 2 world wars to achieve that, like we did in the last century. We want to have some other mechanisms that will prevent conflict but preserve ethics. And I think that is the medium that we need to discover. And an EU-India project and a Central European India project is essential to that. I think it is us who have most at stake, because our future is on the line. This was the time when we needed to grow. This was the time when you needed to grow your per capita incomes 2 to 3 times in the next 2 decades. We needed to grow lift our people from low income to middle income. We have much more at stake. The more the world is in turmoil, the less we are going to be able to grow sustainably. So I think it is in our interest now to start investing in institutions or even informal institutions that will preserve a degree of values and allow for a degree of stability. It's not going to be the perfect solution, but I think a coalition that has countries from Central Europe, from Western Europe, from Asia like India, Australia, Japan is an important coalition. And I think this will normalize the behavior of both America and China. I don't think both of them have behaved responsibly in the last few years. One, because of its democratic craziness. The second, because of its absolute medieval mindset. So you have a democratic failure at one end and a despotic emergence at the other end. And we need to make sure that democracy survives this moment. And therefore, middle powers need to be normalize this moment, the silly season that the world is going through.
We also have something else, and which we haven't discussed, and being, coming from Central Eastern Europe, it's just any conversation is impossible without mentioning this, and that is Russia. Since you have India has developed good relations with Russia in many ways. You see Russia as being instrumental in regional stability and so on and so forth. We see Russia as one of the main destabilizing factors, both in Europe, in the West, and specifically in Central Eastern Europe. Do you have any idea of where Russia might stand in the arrangement that you're describing? Are we going to be able to work with Russia? Will it be on our side or will it be on China's side, as it sometimes seems to, although their agendas perhaps only align when it's opportune for both of them to do so. But where is Russia in this whole
No,
thing?
Russia is a very interesting global actor. I have been writing a lot on Russia. I've been traveling to Russia a lot in the last decade or more. I have lots of excellent friends and colleagues who attend our programs, write for us. Uh, and I can tell you that this is not an easy solution. Russia has a odd reality. It is a country which has a very, very modest GDP. Uh, its size in the BRICS is the second smallest. But it is also a country which admittedly is possibly the second most powerful military force in the world. It has this very odd nature that it is a big military actor with a very small economic size. And what that does is it creates a asymmetry, uh, a policy asymmetry in Moscow. Um, it has very little stakes in global economic stability or global economic progress. It has huge clout in the political consequences or political implications of developments around the world. And I think the Russians have to somehow be made or mainstreamed into our economic future. Unless the Russians are given a stake in the fourth industrial revolution, unless they see benefits and prosperity coming out of our economic future, common economic future, they are increasingly going to remain in terms of its economic policy in the 20th century, and therefore their politics will be associated with that thinking. If they are made part of the economic policies of the future, their politics may evolve. It's not an easy transition. I don't think there are easy answers to this. But I would argue that Russians have to be given more room in European thinking so that they don't feel boxed into the Chinese corner. The last thing we should be thinking about is giving Russia no option but to partner with the Chinese. And again, that is something perhaps the immediate neighbors may not find palatable because you have political histories that you have to contend with. But countries like India can give them that room to maneuver. India could be a market, India could be a consumer, India could be an investor in the Russian economic future. And then again, I think a Central East European Indian partnership becomes important. Can we together play a role in normalizing that relationship? And can we give Russians an option other than China? If India is able to ensure that a large part of Russia's economic future is linked to ours, it doesn't have to be in the Chinese corner. If we are able to grow to our 7 to 8 to $10 trillion size in the next 10 to 15 years, Russia will have a large Indian option to play with. So again, I think India is a release valve. It allows some of the Russian frustrations at being boxed into the Chinese corner to be released. And it allows Central Europeans to deal with a far more rational actor. So I think the Russians are not the Chinese. I think we must understand that the Chinese take hegemony to a different level. But the Russians have this odd asymmetry that defines their place in the world. A small economy and a huge military presence. And I think that asymmetry we need to respond to by creating economic incentives and economic possibilities for the Russians.
And last question, because really we've been discussing a lot how to react to a world that's increasingly defined by China, but we haven't mentioned one thing, which is what are China's plans? What kind of a strategy are we looking at responding to?
No, yesterday or 2 days ago, I was on television and I was talking about the Chinese strategy. I said, I don't know their strategy, but I can tell you, sitting in New Delhi, how I see China's emergence. And I defined it through something what I call the 3M framework, using the alphabet M 3 times. The first, I see them as increasingly becoming the Middle Kingdom. The Chinese exceptionalism is defined in those terms. They believe they have a special space and place in the world. I called it a place between heaven and earth, but I think it's possibly very close to that as a description. And Chinese will increasingly...
It increasingly seems like it's between heaven and hell.
but the Chinese will continue to defy global rules. They believe they don't apply to them. They will not allow global pressures to either change their international behavior or their domestic choices. So you will see the first M, the Middle Kingdom, emerge more strongly in the days ahead. The second, I had mentioned that this Middle Kingdom will be served by modern tools. They have modernity as a tool, not as an experience, and that's the difference. They use modernity to strengthen the Middle Kingdom, not to reform the Middle Kingdom or evolve the Middle Kingdom. And the modern tools include their digital platforms, the control over media, including Western media. As you have read recently, they have bought their way into every blue chip media house in the Western world, in the Atlantic system. Of course, they will use their big digital platforms to acquire, control, and create wealth. And they will, of course, create modern armies with modern weapons to survey, control, and dominate, and sometimes ravage and plunder. And finally, the third M deals with the medieval mindset. So they are a Middle Kingdom with modern tools, but yet with a medieval mindset, which believes in a hierarchical world. We are a world which has moved away from the hierarchies of the past, making the world is more flat. People work as partners, not as vassals. People don't have treaty alliances anymore. They have equal relationships. The Chinese don't see it in that way. They see a hierarchical world where countries must pay tribute to them. They sometimes use the Belt and Road Initiative to create the tribute system. Sometimes they use debt trap diplomacy to buy sovereignty. Sometimes they use other tools to ensure that many of the countries and most of the countries they deal with submit to them. So we are dealing with these three M's which define China of today. Now, build your own strategy, how you want to handle it. We are facing them off in the Himalayas. And so clearly, our immediate response is to ensure that the relentless Chinese machinery driven by a medieval mindset does not proliferate our territory, does not harm our sovereignty, does not harm our society. We will all have to respond to this emergence. We are your front line. So in some sense, we are not doing it just for ourselves because we have to, but we are also in many ways allowing all of you to examine what's happening.